Real horror. Encounters in Texas. True terrifying tales. Story 1. The Unseen Watcher. The night was heavy with humidity, as though the air itself had become thick, making every breath feel like an effort. In Houston, Texas, at 1:30 a.m., Sarah, a 29-year-old office worker, finally completed her grueling shift. She had spent the last 8 hours crunching numbers, preparing reports, and listening to the endless hum of fluorescent lights above her cubicle. Now, as she drove home, she could feel the weight of exhaustion pushing against her. Yet, something wasn't right. The streets were eerily quiet, an unsettling stillness that seemed almost unnatural for the typically bustling city. As she navigated her car through the dimly lit back roads, the occasional flicker of a streetlight added to the sense of unease pressing against her chest. Every shadow in the periphery seemed to stretch longer than it should, distorting the familiar surroundings into something unfamiliar. She told herself it was nothing more than the exhaustion settling in after a long day, the kind of tiredness that makes the world feel a little unreal. But deep down, Sarah couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. The farther she drove, the worse the feeling became. She passed a row of old, abandoned houses that had long since lost their former charm. Their windows were boarded up, the paint peeling off their rotting facades. They had been empty for as long as she could remember, yet tonight they seemed to loom over the street, like silent sentinels watching her progress. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or perhaps the darkness that gave these houses a ghostly presence. She couldn't be sure. It wasn't until she turned onto her street that the atmosphere shifted entirely. The familiar street, once warm with the glow of streetlights, now seemed suffocated by an oppressive darkness. The lamps, which usually provided comforting pools of light, flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows across the cracked sidewalks. She couldn't remember the last time she had seen them fail to shine brightly. It was as if the street itself was retreating from her presence. Her heartbeat quickened. Something about this was wrong, something she couldn't explain. Sarah parked her car, her pulse racing as she noticed the unsettling silence that had fallen over the area. No sounds of cars driving by, no chatter in the distance, not even the hum of the wind. Just an eerie stillness that hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Trying to push aside the feeling that had settled deep in her chest, Sarah grabbed her bag and stepped out of the car. As she moved toward the entrance of her apartment building, her gaze fell on the front gate. For a split second, something caught her eye. There was a dark figure standing there, motionless. At first, she thought it was a cat, or perhaps a shadow cast by the dim light. But as she focused, her heart skipped a beat. The figure didn't seem to have any shape. It was like a dark blotch against the night, an absence of form. It was watching her. Her breath hitched in her throat as the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. A chill ran down her spine. She froze in place, her eyes locked on the figure. It was too far away for her to make out any details. But she could feel its presence, dark, watching, unblinking. Her heart pounded in her chest as she clutched her bag tighter, her mind scrambling to process what she was seeing. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. Maybe she was too tired. The thoughts rushed through her head, but the fear was undeniable. She was not alone. With a shaky breath, she tried to convince herself that it was nothing, that she was simply imagining things. But as she turned her head, something strange happened. The figure was gone, vanished, as though it had melted into the night air. She blinked several times, trying to reconcile what she had just seen. Her feet felt heavy as she continued walking, now moving faster, her pulse still racing in her ears. By the time she reached her apartment door, her hands were trembling. She fumbled with the keys, desperate to get inside, away from the eerie sensation that someone, or something, was watching her. When the door finally clicked open, she rushed in, slammed it shut, and locked it behind her, her breath coming in short, uneven gasps. Inside, it felt quieter than usual. The hum of her fridge, the distant sounds of the city, everything seemed muted, like the world had pressed pause. She tried to shake it off, but the unease still lingered, an invisible weight pressing against her chest. Sarah turned on the lights and sat on her couch, trying to calm her racing thoughts. The faintest sound outside made her jump. She stared at the window. The curtains shifted in the breeze, but there was no one outside. Yet she couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. The hours passed slowly. She tried to distract herself with TV, scrolling through her phone, but nothing could settle the unease that gnawed at her. She couldn't explain it. It wasn't just the encounter with the shadow. It was the feeling that had settled into her bones. She wasn't alone in this apartment. There was something just beyond her sight, waiting. The very walls of the room seemed to hold a secret. Days turned into weeks, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It only grew stronger. Every time Sarah left the apartment and returned, she felt as though something had shifted. She would catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of her eye, but when she looked, nothing was there. The shadows outside seemed deeper, more oppressive. The air inside her apartment felt thick, suffocating, as though someone was standing just behind her, their presence undeniable. Then, one evening, after returning from a late shift, Sarah ran into Mrs. Peterson, an elderly woman who lived one floor above her. Mrs. Peterson had always been kind to her, offering a smile or a quick wave in passing. But today, her usual warm demeanor was gone. Mrs. Peterson's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She grabbed Sarah's arm, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so frail. "Sarah, you have to listen to me," she whispered urgently. "There's something in this building. I've been seeing it for months. Dark figures. They stand in the corners watching, and then they disappear. I don't know if they're ghosts or something worse." Sarah's stomach twisted. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Mrs. Peterson had seen the same figures. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't imagining things. Someone had been watching them, and now she was sure of it. It wasn't just in her mind. It was real. That night, Sarah locked every door and window. She turned on every light and pulled the curtains tightly shut. But the feeling of being watched never left. It was a heavy, oppressive sensation crawling under her skin. She could hear faint whispers in the walls, echoes of something not quite human. Then, late one night, it happened. The shadows outside her window shifted, moving as though they had a life of their own. A cold breeze blew through the cracks of her window and the temperature dropped suddenly, sending a chill through her entire body. She felt it, a hand, ice cold, pressing against the back of her neck. Spinning around, her eyes locked onto the window. There, in the reflection, she saw him. The figure from before, standing in the doorway, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. His lips parted in a silent, mocking grin. Her blood ran cold. She didn't know how long he had been there, watching. But she knew one thing for certain now. She was never alone. Story 2. The Vanishing Hitchhiker of Amarillo. The night had a strange quality to it. The air dry and oppressive, pressing against Jacob's skin as he steered his truck through the vast, empty stretch of highway leading back to Amarillo, Texas. It was a typical Sunday night after a long haul through the desert, and his eyes were heavy with fatigue. He longed for a warm bed and the comforting silence of his own home, but the road stretched on endlessly. The vast desert sprawled around him, the endless emptiness only broken by the occasional flicker of his truck's headlights as they cut through the dusty, arid air. The road was deserted, no other vehicles in sight, just miles of desolate land, with only the occasional cactus or the shadow of a distant mountain to break the monotony. Jacob's eyelids drooped, and he could feel the weight of sleep pulling at him, but he fought it off. He'd been driving for hours, and it wasn't the first time he'd felt the pull of exhaustion. It wasn't until he spotted her that the strange tension started to build. At first, it seemed like a mirage, an odd, shimmering blur at the edge of his vision, but as he drew closer, he realized it wasn't a mirage at all. A young woman stood by the side of the highway, her thumb raised in the universal signal for a hitchhiker. Jacob's truck slowed automatically, even though he knew better than to pick up anyone in the middle of nowhere. He had heard the stories, the warnings about hitchhikers on desolate roads. Most of the time, they were trouble. But this one seemed different. Her appearance struck him as strange. Too clean, too composed for someone stranded on the side of a highway in the middle of the Texas desert. Her clothes were perfectly pressed, an ivory dress that looked almost ethereal under the faint glow of the truck's headlights. Her long, dark hair cascaded down her back in soft waves, and her expression was calm, serene, almost too calm. There was something unsettling about her stillness, the way she stood there in the harsh, unrelenting heat of the night, without a care in the world. Against his better judgment, Jacob pulled the truck over. His mind told him not to, but a feeling deep inside urged him to do so. It was almost like a compulsion, something beyond reason. He rolled down the passenger side window, and she approached with a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you for stopping," she said, her voice soft, almost melodic, as she climbed into the seat next to him. Her scent filled the cab, an unnatural, intoxicating smell of roses, so sweet it almost made Jacob's head spin. He couldn't remember the last time he had smelled roses in the middle of a desert. It was off. Jacob nodded, offering a polite smile, despite the growing sense of discomfort that bubbled in his chest. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual, but he told himself it was just the tiredness playing tricks on him. She seemed harmless enough, just a lonely woman trying to get to her destination, he reasoned. They drove in silence for a while, the hum of the truck's engine and the sound of tires rolling over the asphalt filling the space between them. But then, her voice broke through the quiet, her words almost a whisper, as if she were reading his thoughts. "You don't need to worry about me," she said, her tone serene but oddly knowing. "I've been waiting a long time." Jacob tried to shrug off the unease. Maybe she was just lonely, he thought. A weary traveller with nowhere else to go. Still, a shiver ran down his spine, and he could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. "Just a little further," he muttered to himself, trying to focus on the road ahead. But when he glanced at her out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something strange. Her eyes were glowing faintly, an unnatural gleam to them in the dim light of the truck's interior. There was something unsettling about her gaze, something that made him feel exposed, as if she could see into the deepest corners of his soul. Suddenly she spoke again. "I need to get out here," she said, her eyes gleaming strangely, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Jacob, too tired to argue, nodded and pulled the truck over. The small town she pointed to appeared in the distance, barely visible in the soft glow of the headlights, but Jacob didn't think much of it. He was just ready to drop her off and continue on his way home. But when he turned to look at her, something felt wrong. The woman was gone. He blinked, rubbing his eyes to make sure he wasn't seeing things. Her door had swung open, but there were no signs of her leaving, no footsteps, no traces of her presence anywhere. It was as if she had simply disappeared into thin air. His breath caught in his throat. He sat there staring at the empty seat beside him, the faint scent of roses still lingering in the air. His heart raced as he checked the mirrors, expecting to see her standing by the side of the road. But there was nothing. The desert stretched on, silent and still. Jacob sat frozen for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel as the weight of what had just happened settled in. He tried to reason with himself, but the logic escaped him. Who was she? Where had she gone? His mind was spinning, and his body felt cold despite the heat of the desert around him. The next day, Jacob went to a gas station near Amarillo. As he filled up his truck, he overheard a conversation between two locals. One man mentioned a woman who had been seen along that stretch of highway for years. A woman who would hitch rides with truckers and disappear without a trace. Curious, Jacob approached the man and asked if he had heard of such a thing. The man gave him a long, appraising look before nodding. Yeah, we've heard the stories. They say she's the vanishing hitchhiker. Folks around here know all about her. She's been showing up along that road for as long as I can remember. Every time she gets a ride, she disappears. No one knows where she goes, but she's been doing it for years. Jacob's heart sank. He felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. It had all been too strange, too real. The man continued. A couple of weeks ago, another driver saw her, just like you did. Only this time, when he dropped her off, she left something behind. He didn't notice it at first, but when he drove off, he saw a message on the passenger side window. Jacob's stomach tightened. What did it say? The man's voice dropped as if sharing a secret. It said, "You should have never stopped." Jacob froze, the words echoing in his mind. He could still remember the way the woman's eyes had glowed, the way she seemed to know things about him. And now, the message on the window. It felt like a warning that he had been foolish, that he had done something he wasn't supposed to. The feeling of unease that had settled in the pit of his stomach now intensified. He couldn't shake the thought that he had been a part of something far darker than he could ever have imagined. And now, the woman, the vanishing hitchhiker, wasn't just a myth. She was real, and he had picked her up. Story 3: The Abandoned Farmhouse. David had spent most of his 42 years working as a contractor in all manner of settings, new builds, renovations, and even the occasional repair job in the more rundown parts of Texas. The job offer to renovate an old farmhouse on the outskirts of a small, quiet town had seemed like an easy one. The house was cheap, far cheaper than any property in decent condition, and the work seemed straightforward enough. The homeowner had promised him a quick turnaround, and the idea of spending a few weeks in the isolation of the countryside sounded appealing to David. Little did he know, the farmhouse held a dark secret, a secret that would unravel before his very eyes, turning the job from simple to terrifying. The moment David arrived, he was struck by the silence. It wasn't the silence of a peaceful rural property, the kind he might expect. This silence was unnatural, deep and guttural, as if the house itself was holding its breath. There were no birds chirping in the trees, no rustling of wind through the dry grass, just a thick, oppressive quiet that weighed heavily on him as he pulled up to the house. The farmhouse was every bit as run down as the photos had shown. Broken windows, cracked walls, and a rotting wooden frame that groaned under the weight of years of neglect. Despite the years of disrepair, there was something undeniably sad about the place. It had once been a family home, a place filled with life, laughter, and the energy of its inhabitants. But now, it felt empty, abandoned by time and forgotten by the world. David shrugged off the sense of unease creeping at the edges of his mind and got to work. The first few days were spent outside, patching up broken windows and securing the foundation. But as the days passed, and as he began to move into the interior, things took a strange turn. He was inside the living room one afternoon, sorting through old furniture that had been left behind, when something caught his eye. Photographs scattered across the floor. Old, faded pictures of a family. Smiling faces frozen in time, standing in front of a fireplace that hadn't been lit in decades. The children were dressed in clothes that seemed too formal for a casual family photo, their expressions stiff and posed. There was a palpable sense of stillness in those photographs, a stillness that mirrored the emptiness of the house itself. David picked them up and studied them for a moment, then set them aside, dismissing them as nothing more than remnants of a forgotten past. They were part of the house's history, a history that no longer mattered. He had a job to do after all. But as the days passed, those photographs stayed with him. They didn't just feel like a reminder of the house's past. They felt like a warning. It wasn't until the third day that things began to unravel. David had finished most of the work downstairs and was now turning his attention to the attic. It was a cramped, dark space, filled with dust-covered boxes and the kind of old furniture you only find in homes long abandoned. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but it felt like a natural place to finish up, sorting through the boxes, making sure there was nothing valuable to salvage before he began the real renovation work. As he climbed up the narrow stairs to the attic, he immediately felt the temperature drop. It was subtle, but undeniable, a coldness that pressed against his skin as he reached the top. The air was thick, heavy, as though it had been stagnant for years. David flicked on his flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating old furniture, cobwebs, and boxes stacked haphazardly around the room. Then, as he stepped further into the attic, something shifted. It was subtle at first, a feeling, a sensation. He couldn't explain it, but he felt as if someone was watching him. Slowly, he turned, scanning the room with the flashlight, his breath quickening in his chest. There was no one else in the attic. He was alone. Yet the feeling of being watched grew stronger, suffocating. Suddenly, the attic door slammed shut with a deafening thud, the sound of wood hitting wood reverberating through the small, confined space. David jumped back, his heart leaping into his throat as he spun around. His flashlight flickered and dimmed, casting strange shadows against the walls. The oppressive silence was now broken by the sound of his own breath, ragged and quick. Then he saw it, a figure, tall and thin, standing motionless in the corner of the room. A man, his face obscured by long, greasy hair. The dim light barely touched his figure, but there was no mistaking the shape of him. He was standing, just watching. He was completely still, his eyes fixed on David with an intensity that sent chills down his spine. David's blood ran cold. The man didn't move, didn't make a sound. He was as silent as the rest of the house, a ghostly presence, lurking in the shadows. David could feel his pulse hammering in his ears, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His instinct told him to run, to get out, but his legs felt like lead. His body refused to move. The air around him grew colder, the temperature dropping further, as though the man's presence was sucking the warmth from the room. David's hands trembled as he reached for the door, his mind racing. He had to get out, he had to. He pulled at the door, but it was locked. Panic flooded his chest as he turned the handle again and again, but it wouldn't budge. The man remained standing in the corner, motionless, his dark eyes never leaving David's. The silence grew unbearable. David felt like the walls were closing in on him, the air thick and suffocating. The man's presence seemed to grow more oppressive, as if the very room itself was drawing closer around him. It took every ounce of strength David had to force the door open. When it finally gave, he stumbled backward, heart racing, eyes wide with terror. He didn't look back as he bolted from the attic, slamming the door shut behind him. His breath came in frantic gasps as he made his way down the stairs, the house feeling more and more like a prison with every passing second. When he reached the front door, he stopped for just a moment. his hand hovering over the knob. He didn't know what was worse, the figure in the attic or the suffocating stillness of the house itself. It felt as though something was waiting just beyond the threshold, something ancient and malevolent. But David didn't stay to find out. He wrenched the door open, stepped out into the bright, harsh light of the afternoon sun, and slammed it shut behind him. Later that day, as he tried to shake off the horror of what had just happened, he learned the truth about the farmhouse. The house had once belonged to a reclusive family who had lived there in isolation for years. The rumors had always been whispered in town, stories of the father's madness, his descent into violence, and the tragic fate of his wife and children. The father, it seemed, had gone insane. He had killed his wife and children in that very attic, their bodies hidden away in the cluttered space. But their spirits, especially his, had never left. It was said that the father's ghost roamed the house, watching anyone who dared enter. David never returned to that farmhouse. No amount of money was worth the terror that clung to its walls, its floors, and its very air. The secret of the family and the horrors that had happened there had become something far worse than any renovation project could ever repair. He had come for a simple job, but what he left behind was a piece of darkness he could never escape. And as David drove away from that place, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching him, that something, or someone, was still lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next person foolish enough to enter the farmhouse. Story 4: The Silent Woods of Tyler. Amanda had always been drawn to nature. There was something about the quiet serenity of the outdoors that called to her, offering solace from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. At 24, she was independent, confident, and had always craved new adventures. That's why, when she decided to take a solo camping trip in the dense forests near Tyler, Texas, she felt an unshakable sense of excitement. The area was known for its peace, its untouched beauty, and its seclusion, everything Amanda had been searching for. No technology, no distractions, just her, the forest, and the night sky. She arrived in the late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows over the trees. The air was crisp, filled with the earthy smell of pine and damp soil. She set up camp by a quiet stream that wound its way through the dense woods, the sound of water running over smooth stones creating a natural melody that calmed her nerves. As Amanda arranged her things, she marveled at how perfect the place was, an escape from the noise of the city. The only sounds were those of nature, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of insects, the occasional bird call. Everything felt perfect. But as night fell, that sense of peace quickly began to shift. The forest, which had been alive with noise, seemed to hold its breath as darkness descended. The chirping of insects, the rustling of leaves, everything stopped. There was no wind, no birds, no rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush. The silence grew so intense, it pressed against Amanda's chest, filling the air with an oppressive weight. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a deep forest, the kind of quiet that could lull you to sleep. No, this was something else entirely. This was a dead silence, an unnatural stillness that made her skin crawl. She tried to brush off the unease that began to stir inside her. She was just alone in the woods, she reasoned. It was nothing she hadn't experienced before. It was just the unfamiliarity of the situation making her feel vulnerable. But as she sat by her campfire, watching the flames flicker in the cool night air, that nagging feeling only deepened. The silence around her seemed to grow more intense, more unnerving with every passing minute. Amanda climbed into her tent, zipping it up tightly, and settled onto her sleeping bag. She tried to focus on the peaceful sounds of nature she had grown so accustomed to, but all she could hear now was the rapid beating of her own heart. The wind that had been blowing earlier had completely stopped, and the air outside was heavy, thick with an unsettling quiet. She reached for her phone, but the screen flickered, the signal long gone in the wilderness. It only served to remind her that she was truly alone. It wasn't long before she heard it, a soft whispering sound, faint but distinct, like a chant in an unfamiliar language. Amanda's breath caught in her throat, and she sat up in her tent, straining to listen. The whispering was so soft at first that she wasn't sure if she had imagined it. Maybe it was the wind after all, she thought. Maybe the trees were swaying and the branches were creaking in a way that sounded like whispering. But as she lay back down, trying to convince herself it was nothing, the whispering grew louder. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the trees. The sound was coming from just outside her tent, as if someone, something, was standing right there, speaking in soft, murmured tones. Her heart began to race, her skin prickling with a cold sweat. The words were incomprehensible, and yet there was something chillingly familiar about them. They weren't random sounds, they were rhythmic, chanting, calling out from the darkness in a way that made her blood run cold. Amanda held her breath, her pulse pounding in her ears. The air around her felt even thicker, as though the very space inside the tent was closing in. She told herself it was just the result of being alone in the woods, that her mind was playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew this wasn't just her imagination. Something was out there. The whispering grew more urgent, more insistent, as if it was trying to reach her, to communicate with her. Then, suddenly the tent flap shook violently, as though something was trying to force its way inside. Amanda leapt to her feet, her breath catching in her throat. Her flashlight flew out of her hand as she scrambled to grab it. She shone the beam of light into the dark night, her hands trembling. But there was nothing but the pitch-black woods surrounding her. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving only the silence, now even heavier than before. Amanda's heart pounded in her chest as she looked around, trying to steady her breath. She was alone, she thought. There was no one out there. But then, as the light from her flashlight danced over the dirt around her tent, something caught her eye. Footprints, small, barely visible, but definitely there. They circled her tent in the dirt, slow and deliberate. The prints weren't from any animal she could recognize. They were too small, too perfectly placed, and they didn't follow a natural path. They seemed to spiral inward, as though whatever had left them was watching her, circling her, getting closer and closer with every step. Her blood ran cold. Amanda's instinct kicked in, and without thinking, she grabbed her backpack, her flashlight, and bolted from the tent. She ran blindly through the trees, her feet crashing against the underbrush, her breath ragged in her chest. She didn't stop to look behind her, but the feeling of being followed, of something hot on her heels, was inescapable. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made her blood run colder. She couldn't outrun the fear that gripped her heart. Finally, after what felt like hours, Amanda stumbled upon a road, her legs trembling beneath her. She looked up, and in the distance, she saw headlights approaching. With a last burst of energy, she waved her arms, desperate for help. The car screeched to a halt, and the driver, a confused man, asked what was wrong. Amanda couldn't speak. She could barely catch her breath. She just climbed into the car and slammed the door shut. She didn't look back at the woods. She didn't want to know what might still be out there, waiting in the dark. Years later, Amanda would learn the truth about the forest where she had camped. The area was believed to be haunted by the spirits of Native American children who had once lived in the nearby village. The children had been taken in the middle of the night, their lives tragically cut short and their bodies lost to time. The whispering she had heard in the woods that night was said to be their cries for help, a warning to anyone who dared to disturb their resting place. It was said that the spirits of the children still roamed the woods, seeking justice for their untimely deaths. The footprints, the whispers, everything Amanda had experienced that night wasn't just a product of her imagination. It was a message, a warning. And from that day forward, she never ventured near those woods again.